In the heart of a storm that seemed older than the mountains themselves, a lone rescue dog tore through the darkness because he sensed a secret the world wasn't meant to hear. And when Mason Hale, a man haunted by the past he tried to bury, followed his loyal companion into the swamp, he didn't just find a drowning officer. He uncovered the beginning of a nightmare that would change both their lives forever. Shadows were watching, truth was hunting, and fate was already choosing its survivors. If this story pulls you in, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more mysterious, emotional tales waiting just beyond the next storm. The storm rolled across the Oregon mountains like an old god waking angry, its voice tearing through the treetops, rattling the glass windows of Mason Hale's cabin as though demanding entry. But inside, the former mountain rescue officer sat motionless in the dim glow of the fire. A man carved from silence, from grief, from years of holding his breath in a world that had stopped feeling safe to him after one mission went wrong. The night he lost a child on a frozen ridge. The night he swore he would never again run into danger, only to return with empty arms. But storms have a way of remembering the names of the people who try to escape them. And on this night, they called Mason back to the life he thought he had buried in the snow. Mason's cabin was small, simple, and worn like a coat passed down through generations, its wooden beams heavy with the scent of pine and smoke, every creak in the floor familiar to him, like old friends still trying to keep him company even as he pushed the world away. But there was one soul he hadn't been able to shut out. Valor, his German shepherd, 5 years old, sharp-eyed, steady-hearted, a dog trained not just to save lives, but to anchor the trembling hands of a man learning to live with ghosts. Tonight, Valor lay stretched near the hearth, his amber eyes half closed, his ears flicking every so often at the restless singing of the wind. But when the storm shifted, Valor stiffened first. One heartbeat, then another. His head snapped up. A low, warning rumble rose deep in his chest as he stood slowly, every muscle rigid. And Mason felt something old inside him wake too. That instinct that never really dies in men who were trained to sprint toward danger while everyone else ran from it. But Mason had promised himself he would never answer that instinct again, so he whispered, "Easy, boy," even though his voice betrayed the lie trembling through it. Valor didn't look away from the door, his ears pinned forward. The rumble sharpened. Then came the bark. One sharp, frantic explosion of sound that cut through the cabin like a blade and made Mason's breath falter, because dogs don't lie about danger. And this wasn't the bark of curiosity or excitement. This was fear, urgent and raw. Before Mason could speak, Valor lunged at the door, scraping claws against the wood as if the storm itself were calling him by name. Mason felt his pulse tighten, his chest ache with the weight of a memory he tried not to revisit. But when a dog like Valor chooses fear over obedience, it means someone, somewhere, is begging the night not to swallow them. "Valor, wait," Mason said, grabbing his flashlight and the heavy coat hanging near the door. But Valor pushed through the opening the moment Mason cracked it, vanishing into the storm-soaked darkness with the desperate determination of a creature who has heard a cry the world has not yet translated. Mason stepped outside, the cold rain slapping his face like a reprimand, the wind roaring against his coat, as if trying to shove him back into the safety he once demanded from life. But the man who had once dug through avalanches with bare hands could not let a scream, silent or otherwise, be ignored. The forest was a black maze of twisted branches and dripping moss, every shadow shifting like frightened animals. And yet Valor's shape flashed between the pines, steady and certain, guiding Mason deeper into the night. Mason pushed through ferns slick with rain, his boots sinking into mud that clung like desperate fingers, the storm swallowing every sound except one. Valor's frantic barks echoing through the trees, each one sharper, more panicked than the last, and Mason felt the old familiar pressure in his chest, the pressure of a man who knows he is running toward something that might break him again, yet cannot stop. Then came a sound that froze him mid-stride, a human cry, ragged, choking, splintered by terror, cut through the crashing rain like a plea carved straight from a dying breath. And Mason ran, branches whipping his face, mud splashing up his legs, flashlight beam jittering wildly until it sliced across something pale, struggling in the black water below. She was sinking. Not slowly, but as if the swamp itself had claimed her. Only her face remained above the surface, eyes wide, mouth trembling, rain running down her cheeks like the sky weeping for her. A badge glimmered weakly at her shoulder. A police officer. A woman fighting the kind of fear that shatters even the bravest hearts. Valor stood at the water's edge, barking wildly, as if yelling for Mason to hurry, to choose differently this time, to save the soul clawing at the edge of life. Mason dropped to his knees, the storm blurring his vision as memories he had spent years burying clawed their way up. Snow, a child's hand slipping from his grasp, the sound of a mother screaming behind him. But this time, the world had given him another chance, another heartbeat to rewrite the ending he carried like a wound. "Hold on!" he shouted, reaching toward her, his voice breaking through the rain as if finally remembering its purpose. And as her trembling fingers reached back, barely visible through mud and darkness, Mason Hale realized the truth he had run from for years. There are storms you hide from, and storms you were born to walk into. And some nights, whether you want to or not, God sends a cry into the wind to remind you which kind of man you are. Mason Hale carried the half-conscious woman into the cabin with the same steadiness he once used while lifting injured climbers off mountain ledges, though this time the weight felt different, heavier in ways the body couldn't measure, because he wasn't just lifting a stranger out of danger, he was lifting himself out of a grief he had pretended no longer existed. The storm slammed the door behind him as if sealing the past outside, while Valor shook water from his coat before circling anxiously around Mason, urging him wordlessly to hurry. Mason knelt beside the fire, lowering the woman's mud-soaked body onto a wool blanket, the flicker of flames casting trembling light across her face. She was young, but not fragile, with the hard-earned lines of someone who had fought her way through too many long nights. And when Mason brushed wet hair from her cheek, her skin felt cold enough to bruise the heart. He checked her pulse, fast but fading, then loosened the collar of her soaked uniform, his hands moving by instinct, guided by years of rescue training that had lived dormant inside him, like embers waiting for air. Valor lay down beside her, nose pressed gently near her shoulder, as if lending her the warmth of his own heartbeat. Mason felt a sting rise behind his eyes, because the last time he'd tended to someone in this cabin had been years ago, and the small carved wooden toy, belonging to the lost boy he failed to save, still sat on the shelf, a silent witness to his promise that he would never again let another life slip through his hands. He forced the memory down, focusing on the woman's breathing. "Stay with me," he murmured, though he didn't know her name. The fire popped softly as if answering him, filling the silence that had once been a friend and now felt like a weight he didn't want to carry alone. After several long moments, her eyelids fluttered, her breath hitching as if she were waking from a nightmare too real to leave fully behind. She coughed, mud-stained water spilling from her lips, and Mason lifted her gently, supporting her shoulders, murmuring steady reassurance until the coughing eased. Her eyes opened, hazel, sharp, and trembling with exhaustion, and for a moment she looked at Mason like someone who wasn't sure whether she had been saved or stolen from the grave too early. "You're safe," Mason said, his voice more gentle than he intended, and she blinked, as though trying to believe him but unable to trust the world enough to accept safety without question. She swallowed hard, tried to sit, and winced as pain traveled through her body, so Mason steadied her with one arm. The contact made her breath tremble in a way that wasn't just physical pain, but something deeper, a soul worn thin. What's your name?" she whispered, each word pressed through raw fear. "Mason Hale," he answered, and after a beat added, "You're in my cabin. My dog and I pulled you from the swamp." She glanced at Valor, who wagged his tail once, a slow, gentle reassurance, and something in her expression softened for the first time since waking. "I'm Sarah Quinn," she managed, her voice cracking around the syllables of her own name, as if saying it out loud reminded her of everything she'd nearly lost. She stopped, eyes darting to her uniform, to the badge half hidden beneath mud, and Mason recognized the flicker in her gaze. Fear mixed with shame. The kind that grows in people who survived something they weren't meant to survive. He had seen that look in fellow rescuers returning from missions that ended in silence instead of celebration. He had worn that look himself. "You don't have to explain anything yet," Mason said, handing her a mug of warm water. But Sarah shook her head, gripping the mug with trembling fingers as tears filled her eyes. Not loud tears, but the quiet kind that burn deeper. The ones people cry only when they no longer have the strength to pretend. "They left me," she whispered, staring into the fire as though the flames held the memory. "My own unit. They put me there, in the swamp." Mason felt the air freeze inside him. He moved closer, not touching her, but sitting where she could feel the steadiness of someone who would not look away. "Why?" She swallowed again, the firelight revealing bruises blooming along her collarbone. "Because I uncovered something I wasn't supposed to," she said. "Something in my department. Drugs being moved through evidence storage. Money passed under tables. I reported it. Or I tried." Her jaw trembled. "They chased me, took my radio, beat me, and when I ran, they decided the swamp would finish what they started." Valor pressed his head against her shoulder, as if to say he believed her without question. Mason felt something shift inside him. Anger, protectiveness, the heavy ache of recognition. Because betrayal leaves a wound different from any physical injury. It leaves a person questioning their worth, their sanity, their very place in the world. Mason understood that feeling too well. "You're safe here," he repeated, but this time the words carried a promise, not just comfort. She looked at him, studying his face as though she wanted to trust him but needed proof that he wasn't another person who would turn away when things became difficult. What she saw must have been enough, because her breath steadied, her shoulders loosened slightly, and she whispered, "Why did you help me?" Mason hesitated, then glanced at the wooden toy on the shelf, the reminder of a vow he had failed to keep. "Because this time," he said softly, "I wasn't too late." Sarah closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire wash over her. And for the first time in years, Mason felt the cabin breathe differently, not as a place where he hid from the world, but as a place where someone else's survival had lit a small, fragile flame inside him, a flame he had long believed the storm had extinguished forever. The fire had begun to settle into a steady glow, its warmth wrapping the small cabin like a fragile shield against the storm raging outside. But Mason Hale felt something shift in the air, something older than instinct, quieter than fear, yet unmistakably real. Because Valor, who only moments ago lay curled protectively beside Sarah Quinn, suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward, muscles tightening as though the night itself had whispered a warning meant only for him. And Mason knew the dog was never wrong. Sarah noticed the change too. Even through her exhaustion, her eyes flicked toward the door, a tremor of dread pulling through her body, the kind born from recognizing the footsteps of danger even before it arrives. Mason followed Valor's gaze, listening, not to the storm now, but to the spaces between the raindrops, the places where sound hides when someone is trying not to be heard. And then it came, a faint crunch, a shift of weight on wet pine needles, the deliberate, calculating quiet of someone who knows how to stalk instead of approach. Sarah's breath hitched so sharply it seemed to pull the firelight with it. "Mason," she whispered, voice trembling around a truth she didn't want to speak aloud. "They found me." Mason stood slowly, not with panic, but with the calm of a man who had once faced blizzards on sheer cliffs and learned the art of listening for death without letting it unmake him. Still, he felt something cold crawl across his spine, the same chill he felt the night he failed to reach the boy on the mountain, a reminder that hesitation could cost more than courage ever would. He stepped quietly to the small window, Valor pressed beside his leg like a shadow made of fur and loyalty. And when Mason eased 2 fingers between the boards to widen his view of the storm-lashed forest, he saw it. A flicker of light, too sharp to be lightning, too quick to be accidental. Someone was out there, moving, watching, waiting. Sarah clutched the blanket tighter around herself, pain etched into her expression, not from her injuries anymore, but from the realization that she had brought danger to the one place she wished she hadn't. "I should have kept running," she said, tears gathering at the edges of her voice. "I didn't want anyone else hurt because of me." Mason turned toward her, and something in his face softened. Not pity, but recognition, as though he were seeing a reflection of his own scars and her fear. "You survived," he told her quietly. "And people who survive aren't burdens. They're worth fighting for." Sarah looked down, as if the idea were more foreign to her than betrayal itself. Then Valor growled, a deep, vibrating warning that filled the cabin with an ancient kind of tension, the kind animals feel long before humans catch up. The growl wasn't for the storm. It wasn't for the shifting shadows. It was for something, or someone, approaching the cabin. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the wood. Not panicked, not hesitant. A knock from someone who believed the door already belonged to him. Sarah's face drained of color. "That's him," she whispered, her voice cracking open. "Reese Dalton." Mason froze, not because the knock frightened him, but because of the cold certainty in Sarah's tone, as if the sound had reached into her bones and brought every memory of betrayal back to life. Valor stepped between Sarah and the door, tail low, body braced, ready to do what dogs were born to do, stand between darkness and the person they chose as theirs. The knock came again, followed by a voice that slid through the cracks like oil. "Sarah," the man called, smooth, unhurried, terrifyingly composed. "I'm going to assume you're still alive in there. Open the door. We have things to discuss." Sarah pressed a shaking hand to her mouth, her breath shallow, eyes wide with the kind of fear humans only feel when hunted by someone who once pretended to be a friend. Mason stepped fully between her and the door, his shoulders squared, his eyes steady, not angry, not reckless, but clear in a way that comes only from men who have lost enough to know exactly what they refuse to lose again. "You're not opening that door," he said gently but firmly, and something in Sarah's posture loosened, as though the world had finally handed her someone willing to stand where others stepped aside. Outside, footsteps shifted, more than one set now, and Mason realized Reese hadn't come alone. He felt the weight of that truth settle across his chest like armor being buckled on after years of disuse. "He won't walk away," Sarah whispered. "He can't let me talk. He'll burn the whole forest down if he has to." Mason's jaw clenched. The old part of him, the rescuer, the protector, coming alive like a long slumbering fire reigniting. He walked to the rifle mounted above the hearth, lifted it down with steady hands, and checked the chamber. Valor's eyes followed his every movement, understanding without needing a single word. "If he wants a fight," Mason said softly, "he came to the wrong cabin." But before Sarah could respond, another sound sliced through the storm. The crisp, metallic snap of a weapon being loaded just outside the window. Mason's pulse steadied rather than quickened. He blew out the lantern, letting darkness swallow the room until only the fire's ember light flickered across their faces. Sarah's breath trembled. Valor's stance sharpened. Mason whispered, "Stay behind me." And in that moment, hidden in the storm, hunted by corrupt men, shielded only by a cabin, a dog, and a man rediscovering the courage he thought he had buried, Sarah realized something quietly, painfully beautiful. For the first time since the swamp tried to claim her, she wasn't fighting alone. The storm had sharpened into a cold, relentless whisper, the kind that pinned itself to the skin and refused to let go. And Mason Hale knew the cabin could no longer hold the danger pressing in from every direction. Reese Dalton and his men were not the type to wait for dawn or mercy, and every second spent inside those wooden walls tightened the noose around Sarah Quinn's chances of survival. So Mason made a choice, the kind that rewrites the life of a man who thought he had nothing left to give. He crouched beside Sarah, his voice low, steady, shaped not from fear, but from experience earned on cliffsides where one wrong breath could steal a life. "We have to move," he said, and she nodded, though even that small gesture carved pain across her face, the bruises blooming like unwanted flowers along her collarbone. Valor pressed close to her, nudging her knee with a soft urgency, and Mason watched the silent exchange between woman and dog with a heaviness that grew warmer than grief. Because even broken people find strength when a creature with a beating heart chooses them without question. Mason led them to the back window, cracked just enough to let the storm breathe into the cabin. He slipped through first, boots sinking instantly into cold mud, then reached back to help Sarah, who winced but didn't pause, her courage a quiet, trembling thing that Mason felt honored to witness. Valor followed, landing silently despite the slick ground, his ears angled toward the forest as if he already knew the direction of danger. They slipped into the darkness of the swamp, a place Mason once feared, but now trusted more than the men with guns behind them. The swamp, like the mountain, was honest in its brutality. It didn't lie, didn't betray, didn't pretend to be something safer than it was. Mason guided Sarah through a patch of reeds taller than their shoulders, the blades brushing against their coats like skeletal fingers. And every step was a negotiation with the ground, mud gripping their boots with the hunger of something alive. When Sarah stumbled, Mason caught her, steadying her with a hand at her elbow. "I'm slowing you down," she whispered, shame tightening her voice. "You're alive," Mason answered, his tone soft but stern. "And alive is never a burden." She swallowed a breath, and in the darkness, Mason could almost feel her gathering courage, the way some gather blankets on cold nights, pulling it close because it was the only thing keeping her upright. Valor stopped suddenly, muscles rigid, and Mason dropped to a crouch, pulling Sarah gently down with him. Through the sheet of rain, voices floated across the water. Reese Dalton's calm, cold authority cutting through the night like a disciplined blade, and another man's younger, more uneven voice responding with uncertainty. Mason recognized fear when he heard it. It was in the tremble of breath, the forced steadiness of a man trying to impress someone who valued results over human lives. "They're sweeping the trail," Mason whispered. "We need higher ground." He led them to a small rise, a mound barely above the waterline, but shielded on all sides by reeds so dense they formed a natural shelter. Mason had found it years ago during a search and rescue mission, and had never forgotten its shape, its isolation, the way it seemed untouched by everything except rain and memory. Sarah sank onto the muddy grass, clutching her shoulder as pain rippled through the injured joint. Valor lay beside her instantly, his body gently pressed against hers, offering warmth, steadiness, a reminder that she was not facing the dark alone. Mason scanned the perimeter, then knelt in front of her. "They won't stop tonight," she said, her voice shaking with more than cold. "Reese, he can't let me testify. He would rather die than lose control." "Then he's about to face someone who already did," Mason replied quietly, and the words carried a weight Sarah didn't yet understand. Mason stood just as a flashlight beam swept across the opposite bank. A young man, Tyler Knox, waded into the shallow water, muttering curses as mud sucked at his boots. His light skimmed dangerously close to the camouflaged mound where Mason had earlier hidden Sarah's evidence pouch. Mason knew he had seconds to act. He motioned to Sarah and Valor to stay hidden, then slipped into the water like a shadow, the storm masking his movement. Tyler's beam froze on the mound. His breath hitched with a small sound of triumph. But before he could shout, Mason's arm locked around his chest from behind, pulling him down just enough to keep his voice from carrying. Tyler struggled, fear surging through his limbs, but Mason tightened his grip. "Don't reach for your weapon," Mason whispered, and something in his tone, the steadiness of a man who had held dying bodies and still carried their stories, forced Tyler's breath to still. Valor appeared at Mason's side, teeth bared but not touching, a silent promise of consequences if the young operative pushed his luck. Tyler finally froze, his body shaking with a mixture of cold and adrenaline. "Why are you doing this?" he gasped softly. "You don't even know her." Mason's jaw clenched as he bound Tyler's wrists with paracord. "Because someone once needed me, and I wasn't there," he answered, the confession slipping out like a truth he had resisted speaking aloud for years. He dragged Tyler to a patch of reeds, out of sight, leaving him breathing but powerless. When Mason returned to the mound, Sarah's eyes widened, not with fear, but with something else. Something like faith forming for the first time in years. "You saved him," she whispered, "even when he wouldn't have saved you." "I'm not here to be like them," Mason said, his voice softer than the rain falling around them. Valor nudged her again, tail brushing lightly against her leg, as though urging her to believe in the goodness she'd thought was lost from the world. The storm thickened, fog rising from the swamp like breath, wrapping them in a veil of gray. Sarah leaned her head against Mason's shoulder, exhaustion pulling at her like gravity. And Mason let her, because tonight, courage wasn't loud. It was the quiet decision to stand, to shield, to believe again. And for the first time in a long time, as thunder echoed like old sins and the swamp whispered secrets only the desperate ever hear, Mason Hale felt something shift inside him. Not the return of the rescuer he once was, but the awakening of the man he could still become. The swamp had survived the storm, and so had they, though none of the three, Mason Hale, Sarah Quinn, or Valor, would ever walk through the world exactly as they had before that night. Because survival doesn't return people to who they were. It reshapes them into who they were meant to become. And as the months passed and Oregon's mountains turned from gray to green, the memory of that terrible night softened into something almost sacred, a reminder of how resilience grows quietly in the broken places. The first real morning of summer found Mason standing on the porch of his cabin, the wood still damp with dawn, the air holding that sweet mix of pine sap and leftover storm water, a scent that had always whispered home to him, even in the years he tried to run from it. He wore an old gray shirt and jeans that had outlived too many seasons, and though he still carried the bullet scar Reese Dalton left on his shoulder, the pain no longer curled through him like a warning. It lived there now as a testament, a thin, pale line that reminded him he had chosen to step between darkness and another human being, and survived. Valor bounded across the yard in that clumsy, joyful way dogs seem to master only after they've earned the right to feel safe again, a bright green tennis ball held proudly between his teeth, as if it were the trophy for winning a war. He dropped it at Mason's boot with a thump, sat tall, tail sweeping the ground in an unhurried rhythm, and Mason couldn't help the small, quiet smile tugging at his lips. "What?" he asked. "You think I have nothing better to do than play fetch all morning?" Valor blinked back with utter certainty, and Mason laughed, the kind of laugh that sneaks up on a man who once believed joy was something meant for other people. He picked up the ball, wound his arm back, and threw it just as a dusty blue pickup truck rolled slowly down the gravel path. Valor skidded to a halt mid-run, ears pricking forward as the truck came to a stop. Mason's hand dropped automatically to Valor's back, not out of fear, but habit, a protector's reflex that never truly fades. The passenger door opened, and Sarah Quinn stepped out, balancing a baking dish in her good hand, her shoulder fully healed, but carrying the invisible weight of a woman who had seen the worst of people and still chosen to believe in better. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, her jeans faded at the knees, her t-shirt simple, and yet Mason noticed, quietly, privately, that she carried herself with a steadiness she hadn't possessed that night in the swamp. Her scars hadn't disappeared. They had become part of her courage. "Brought you something," she said, lifting the dish. "I baked. Don't ask if it's good." Mason chuckled as she climbed the porch steps carefully, not because the porch was uneven, though it was, but because something about approaching this cabin had become a deliberate gesture for her, a return to the place where her life had cracked open and, somehow, begun again. "If Valor approves it," Mason said, "I'll consider it edible." "He'll eat anything," she replied, and Valor barked, offended by the slander. They sat on the porch, two chipped mugs filled with coffee cooling beside them, steam coiling lazily in the morning air. Sarah wrapped her hands around her cup, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. "Internal affairs finalized everything," she said, her tone steady but threaded with the relief of someone who had carried a truth too heavy for too long. "Reese and the others pled out. The evidence, it was airtight." Her voice faltered for just a moment, like a lone leaf trembling on a quiet branch. "It's over." Mason nodded, but he didn't celebrate. He knew endings were never clean, not when betrayal is involved. But he also saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there the night she nearly drowned. Hope, fragile, but determined. Valor trotted back, dropping the ball at Sarah's feet this time. Mason raised a brow. "He trusts you more today," he said. Sarah smiled softly. "Maybe he sees I'm getting better." She tossed the ball, left-handed but surprisingly smooth, and Valor exploded into a sprint, a streak of tan and black cutting through the early morning light. When she spoke again, her voice held a confession. "On the bad nights," she hesitated, "I practice throwing the ball. It keeps my mind from going back to the water, to the mud pulling me down." Mason leaned back against a porch post, the wood warm at his shoulder. "The nightmares," he said quietly. "Still happening?" "Less," she answered. "But sometimes they come with names." Mason stared into the tree line, where sunlight filtered through like sifted gold. "That's how you know you're still human." Sarah studied his profile for a long, thoughtful moment. "Do yours have names?" Mason let the silence stretch long enough for the answer to settle into both of them before he spoke. "They used to," he said. "Now, they just have lessons." Sarah held that response carefully, as though it were a gift she didn't want to drop. The morning deepened, the world around them shifting into a rhythm neither storm nor violence could take away. Sarah rose slowly, setting the empty mug aside. "Mason," she said, her voice soft, warm, almost fragile. "I know you didn't ask for any of this, but I wouldn't be here if you hadn't opened that door." Mason met her eyes with the kind of steady sincerity a man rarely gives twice in his life. "Nobody comes out of a storm alone." Valor nudged the ball once more, eager for another throw, as sunlight caught the raindrops still clinging to the pine needles, turning them into tiny shards of light. Sarah tossed the ball. Mason stood beside her, and the three of them, rescuer, survivor, and the loyal dog who refused to let darkness win, watched it. Arc across the clearing like a promise that healing, though slow, always waits for those willing to walk toward the sun. After all the storms, the chase through the swamp, and the long nights where fear felt louder than hope, Valor, the brave German shepherd who refused to let darkness win, finally stepped into a new chapter of his life. No longer just a rescuer's partner or a silent guardian, he became the heartbeat that brought two wounded souls back to the light. And Mason Hale, the man who once believed his life had shrunk into grief and solitude, found his world widened again by courage, connection, and the quiet miracle of being needed at the right moment. Their lives, once shaped by loss, now moved toward peace, slowly, tenderly, beautifully. Proof that even the deepest scars can learn to shine when shared with the right companions. As we close this journey, let us wish Valor and Mason gentle days, safe paths, and a future free from storms. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and follow for more extraordinary tales that remind us hope often arrives on four paws, and always at the moment we need it most.